Hi, everybody. Hey, hope you're well. Hope you're having a good week. We are moving forward. We are going to be talking this week specifically about behavior misconduct. Again, this is a really important topic to discuss because it's unfortunately something that you'll see very soon here on the next slide that still occurs throughout this country. And again, it's really disappointing when you see it, when you experience it, when you know historically how law enforcement, how the criminal justice system has fought to try to change the dynamics of it, and yet it's something that we still have to contend with and still deal with. So that's what this discussion is going to be about this week is why do we still have it? What are the examples of why we have it? Who are the individuals that have the propensity to get involved in it? And what can law enforcement organizationally do to address it? So with all those things, you can see our objectives for this week. We're going to talk about decision making. We're going to get into the discussion of discretion. With discretion comes a huge amount of accountability. We're going to talk about the different types of deviancy, different types of misconduct behavior, why it still exists, and then also the last thing I'm just going to summarize real briefly is a review of what organizations are doing to address it, how it looks mechanically from a personnel complaint component or a review. With that, I want to show something that is incredibly timely and incredibly relevant, and it falls right in, unfortunately, to the discussion that we're having today.
Five former Rankin County, Mississippi Sheriff's Office deputies and a former Richland, Mississippi officer, all of them white, received prison terms for their dehumanizing abuse of two innocent black men, including physical and sexual assaults, racist taunting, and firing a gun into one victim's mouth. Working together, these defendants broke into the victim's home, arrested them without probable cause, handcuffed them, tased them, held them down and poured liquids into their mouths, and sexually abused them, in addition to shooting one victim in the mouth. The defendants then tried to cover up the crimes. And in a separate incident, one defendant beat and threatened another person to coerce a confession while two other defendants stood by. Seeking to drive their black victims out of town, defendants treated them like no human being should ever be treated. But they didn't anticipate the victims' courage to come forward and tell the truth. They thought they'd get away with it. They sought to send a message, but we sent one instead. The Justice Department will not tolerate police misconduct. Officers are not above the law in our country. We will seek accountability. Law enforcement officers will suffer consequences and receive severe sentences when they abuse their authority. By holding these officers accountable, we're making clear that law enforcement abuse of black people or any American will not be tolerated in our country. The lawlessness and impunity that fueled the defendants' misconduct not only harmed these victims, but also stripped away the community's sense of security and eroded public trust in the police.
So again, I really wanted to show that video to you because I think it's incredibly important because it's so timely, unfortunately. Again, you look at the date there. This is Thursday, March the 21st, 2024. And again, so this is not ancient history. This is not something that we're talking about that happened 6 years ago, 3 years ago. It's something that's happening right now. And that's why I wanted to show it to you because, again, this is a small county. It's in Mississippi, and yet six officers felt that what they did was okay to do it. And what's probably more alarming is the fact that probably the entire organization of Rankin County Sheriff's Department knew that these kind of activities were taking place. This particular group, they had a nickname. They were known as the Goon Squad. Again, when you think about what that means, what is a Goon Squad? I think you get an idea in your head. It means someone who's probably a bully, someone who's a thug, someone who's out doing things they shouldn't be doing, and yet it was tolerated within that organization. Whether it was tolerated um, out in the open or whether it was just something people turned a blind eye to, who knows? But either way, something like this doesn't just unfold overnight. Now, this particular individual, this group of goon squad officers in Rankin, basically they went into this home. They didn't have probable cause. They might have had reasonable suspicion, think, hey, something's going on there. And had they done everything properly and ethically and legally, they might have found out something that was going on, but that wasn't appeared to what happened. They just basically took matters into their own hands. They went into some individual's home, detained two people for whatever reason, and basically went through this barrage of misconduct. And again, that is an example of why we're having this discussion because those six officers in Mississippi, some small little county in Mississippi, I'm sure that department probably isn't any bigger than maybe 100 officers at top. What they did, what their actions did, it doesn't resonate just with those six officers or that particular county or that particular state. It will resonate throughout the law enforcement community as a whole. And that's really a sad statement when you consider that there's over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. There's over 800,000 officers that support those law enforcement agencies. Every day, there's officers that are out there doing good, that are trying to serve people, try to doing things ethically and morally. And yet the bad behavior, the misconduct of officers like what she just spoke about will resonate not just with that small group, but it will resonate with the entire community. So I really want you to embrace that and think about that because that's how important the discussion and the preventative measures that need to be implemented to impact misconduct are needed and required. So when we think about different perspectives on police, abuse or misbehavior. Again, there's a lot of different ones. We're going to focus on three of them, and a lot of this material is coming out of your text. So again, I want you to refer to your text to get some, a lot more specifics. But there's what's known as the universalistic perspective, which again, when you think about universal or universalistic perspective, what does that mean? It means a universal perspective. It basically means that it's an opportunity to have a creative, objective, systematic approach to solving problems. Now, this is an exact contrast to what's known as a closed belief system, where again, it's not up for discussion, it's not up for review, but it's very closed. So that universal perspective is it's the way of problem solving. It's a way of looking at things at a systematic, objective, creative level. There's also the sociological perspective, again, which emphasizes the social context in which the officer was hired and trained. So again, for that example of the officers in Mississippi, were they trained? Were they hired properly? Were the right ones hired? Did they go through a background check? Did they do everything to make sure that they had the right officers in? And then once those officers were in place, were they trained properly or were they not trained properly? Was there a blind eye turned towards their actions and how they treated people and how they handled scenes? That is an example of the sociological perspective. Now, the physiological perspective, again, it's concerned with the nature of the policing personality. Who was hired? Why were they hired? What belief system did they come in with? What do they feel is important? Did they come to law enforcement for the right reasons or did they come to it for the wrong reasons? And then lastly, it's that organizational perspective. It's the formal and an informal factors. What's allowed from based on policy and procedure, and what's allowed based upon behind the scenes that maybe they don't people don't see and all know, but they know that hey, something's weird going on with this group of officers and how they're doing things. But they're getting results. They're stopping crime. They're doing their business. So I'm just going to turn a naked eye to it and not really worry about it. That's an example of that organizational perspective that also involves that police culture. Now, when we look at the perspectives of police behavior, again, in our text, we talked about what Warden identified. He identified five specific things, and that's the view of human nature, it's the role and orientations, it's attitudes towards legal and department restrictions, it's belief and behavior based upon who you are contending or who you're working with or dealing with in the community or clientele. And then it's also about the relationship between management and peer groups and support. Is there that relationship or is there not that relationship? And is that a healthy or is that a bad relationship? So those are the things, again, when you get a chance this week, make sure you're looking into those things. And because we're going to talk about those a lot more as the semester unfolds, and you're going to be seeing that information in different places, I can guarantee it. Now, there's also two additional theoretical perspectives that have been explained. There's the socialization theory. And again, basically what that means is police behavior is determined more by work experience and by peers than by pre-employment values and attitude, which basically means that whether it's formal or whether it's informal, an officer goes into an organization and they start to take on the the things that are allowed in that organization. They start to take on either the good traits or they can take on the bad traits. And so again, that is really something that the organizational leadership has to be cognizant of. Is there bad behavior that's going on maybe at 2 o'clock in the morning that's not going on at 2 o'clock in the afternoon? And is that based upon who are the people out in the field? What activities are allowed or not allowed? How are they supervised? Is everyone supervised the same? Are people adhering to policies and procedures the way things should be done, or are certain groups not listening? So again, that is the example of the socialization theory. Now, the other theory is what's known as the predispositional theory. And the predispositional theory, it really talks about four stages that an officer's socialization occurs when they're looking at how they're hired or what they're hired. So when you think about it, what in the predispositional theory kind of resonates to you? It's about what is the characteristics, what are the values, what are the attitudes that an individual should have before they're even employed? What should they think is important? Community service, service to others, apathy, compassion, all those things should be looked at. It's about the occupation that attracts these kind of attitudes and beliefs. Or do you have somebody on the other end of the scale who wants to go to law enforcement for all the wrong reasons? Those are the aspects that we have to look at and understand. Now, when you think of an early examination of police behaviors, which they are, so we're going back to 1966, and we're going to look at again, it's more detailed out in your text, and so really spend time in there, but it's justice without trial. And really, what does that mean? It's really kind of a symbolic assault. It's assailant. It basically it's a person or the officer thinks that it's potentially dangerous. There's dangers that signify problems. So a person's behavior, language, address, it causes somebody to act in a certain way before they might even, that person might actually show that, yes, this is the way I actually am. And so it's really important. It's almost that predetermination as when they make contact with somebody or think about somebody. Variants of police behavior, again, you think about the different styles that we talked about, the watchman style, the aggressive officer as opposed to a reactive officer, intervention as opposed to prevention, the legalistic style that goes with it. And then when you think of the violence in policing, think about, solidarity in the groups. What's allowed, what's not allowed. That discussion that occurred in Mississippi with those groups of officers is an exact example. That stuff doesn't happen overnight. That was a long-term process where those officers basically became bad. They might have got hired in the wrong way. They might have started out like, yeah, we got to keep an eye on them, but you don't get those type of actions overnight. Those things happen, and I can guarantee you, if you went back and historically looked at that unit, which I'm sure they did, and looked at those officers, you're going to start to see an increase of more and more patterns of behavior that are similar to what they ultimately got arrested for. And it, again, it evolves, it changes like anything else. Now, there's also what's known as working the streets, and it's about how someone would work it and that discretion that they use. There's crime fighters, and there's people that just kind of want to have that service style where they're not really aggressive and they're just kind of laid back. But when in every case, there's the different types of styles that law enforcement and personnel use. And then there's the culture itself. There's that police culture. There's that coercion, and then there's that, hey, it's us against them type of mentality, that solidarity process that's in place. So when you think about that, how does that impact decision making within the law enforcement personnel discretion aspect? And when you think of discretion, again, it's about the understanding of the circumstances. Are they favorable? Are they not favorable? Are there sanctions? Are there not sanctions? Is it within the legal realms of responsibility of an organization or an individual? So there was four findings that came out that started to focus on that. You had organizational variabilities, neighborhood variabilities, situational variabilities, and then individual officer. Now, organizational, it's based upon kind of the bureaucratic nature of an organization. How do they work? How do they function? How do shifts work? Is there direct policing overview of behavior? When you look at the neighborhood aspect in those factors, it's about the racial composition of a particular group. Does the composition of the neighborhood meet the composition of the police department? Are they striving for that balance? Also, ethnicity related to sex and ethnicity and sexual preference. All of those things go in there. And then also, is there higher values of force during encounters with suspects in disadvantaged neighborhoods as opposed to neighborhoods that are not considered disadvantaged? Those are the things that have to be looked at. How do personnel work and how do law enforcement work in different communities and different neighborhoods? Because it should be all very consistent. It doesn't make a difference if it's a disadvantaged neighborhood or if it's a very affluent neighborhood. The approach of law enforcement, their policies, their procedures, all has to remain consistent. Now, when you think also of situational variables, are all situations handled the same? No. Am I going to handle or are you going to handle a missing child the same way that you would handle a barricade? Would there be racial profiling involved? Would there be gender profiling involved? Would there be, if you look at a suspect who has got tattoos all up and down his arms and sleeves, and you can see that, okay, they're involved in a gang activity, would that change the way you would handle a call for service if they got there and they said, hey, listen, my child's been missing for 2 days and I need your help? Would you handle that based upon the circumstances of the call, or would you have a predisposition to treat that individual based upon what you think their gang affiliation is or how their gang affiliation is? There's also individual officer variables, and those can be things that you're dealing with right now: your age, your experience, your race, your gender, your ethnicity, your sexual preferences, your education. All of those things go into the decision-making process. So why is there deviance in law enforcement? Why does misconduct occur? And again, realize that misconduct is not merely an act. It can also be an omission. It could be you see somebody being involved in bad behavior, you see an excessive use of force, and you make a decision, well, I'm not going to report it. I don't want to get involved in that. I don't want to be the one that's the rat or laying people out. So I'm just going to turn my head to that. That is a perfect example of omission of an act. There's also the act. You're involved in that use of force where you use too much force. So there was three different things that were decided on when they looked at the conformity of norms or the expectations of conformity to norms. And that's really where misconduct occurs, when you don't fall within those norms or those expectations of what's ethical and what's moral. So there's that ethical standard. When you think of the ethical standard, again, look at the principles that how that kind of basically detail how officers will conduct themselves, both internally and externally. What are their personal values? What are the things that they bring in? Do they take their morals and then apply them at an ethical level, at an organizational approach towards how they institute those out into the community? Very important. There's also that organizational standard. Now, that organizational standard, it can be formal or it can be informal. It can be formal in the process of policies on rules and procedures, and then it can be informal in the expectations of, well, how's my peer going to look at me? I know the policy says to do this, but I watch this guy I really enjoy working with. He's got a lot of years on the job, or she's got a lot of years on the job, and they do it this way. So you know what? I'm not going to really do what the policy says. I'm going to do what this person does because I really respect that. That would be an example of the informal influence over how someone would act. Now, what's really important too is the legal standards. Do they deviate from what the legal standards are within society? Are they represented by the laws? Is there due process in those laws? Now, when you think of, again, continuing again within our text, Kane and White in 2009, they classified a lot of different types of misconduct. There's misconduct related to profit motivated crimes. Again, I'm going to go shake down somebody who's selling dope and let them continue to sell dope, but I'm going to take some money from them or I'm going to take some dope from them. That would be an example of profit motivated crime. Off-duty crimes against persons. Somebody goes out and they get involved in an off-duty situation and then they don't tell anybody about it, or they do it because they think they have the color of authority even if they're off duty. So again, a lot of those type things. Drugs, substance abuse within the law enforcement community. That's an example of misconduct. On-duty abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, whatever it might be. Obstruction of justice, not allowing somebody to get their due process. Administration failures, failure to perform, conduct. All these different things are an example of the different deviances or types of misconduct that are identified. Now, again, when you look at it, think about the four kinds of deviances that are there also. There's police crime, there's occupational deviancy, the police corruption, and abuse of authority. Now, occupational, again, is where you don't conform to standards. You're not doing the normal work that's should be considered ethical or correct or within policy and procedure. Occupational, it's based upon the same type of things what you're looking at. And then abuse of authority, it's where you're looking at three different elements. You're looking at excessive force, you're too aggressive, you're beating up too many people, you're getting involved in use of forces for no reason. There's verbal assaults, there's harassment, there's violent constitutional, you're violating people's constitutional right to the Fourth Amendment, the Second Amendment, the First Amendment, all these different things that can happen at a city, a state, and a federal level. Those are things, again, the rights of an individual. Those are examples of abuse of authority or doing those actions under the color of authority. When you think of it again, there's variations to the extent that these things happen. And the Knapp Commission, which again focused on the New York Police Department, this occurred in the 70s, and this was based upon a review of the corruption that was occurring in and around the New York Police Department. It was also based upon why is corruption occurring, what type of force is involved in this corruption, are they getting profit in this corruption? They identified two very specific type of individuals that are involved. One were known as the grass eater. The grass eater is basically someone who accepts graft or accepts money, but they don't necessarily go out and solicit it. It's just something, if it comes along, I'll take it. Now, on the other end of that spectrum is what's known as the meat eaters. The meat eaters in this Knapp Commission review were the deviant officers who actually went out and they actively solicited opportunities to get financial gain. And so, like the example I gave, they would find out someone was dealing drugs. They would break into that house. They would take the drugs, take the money, and say, "We'll allow you to keep operating, but you're going to keep paying us a portion of money to do so." Those are the two examples. Now, the Knapp Commission also gave up several other definitions that I want you to take a look at. Those include the white knights, the straight shooters, the grass eaters, the meat eaters, the rogues. So look in your text, see what each of those are, and think about how they relate to the Knapp Commission and how they differ from the meat eaters and from the grass eaters on the other both ends of that scale. Where do they fall into place? Now, why does corruption continue to persist? So again, that video I showed you, that wasn't from the Knapp era. That wasn't from 1970. It wasn't from the Rodney King era, if you remember that in Los Angeles back in 1993, where the Christopher Commission was formed, and they basically did the same thing that the Knapp Commission did. And the Knapp Commission was basically a predecessor to the Wickersham Commission, which we talked about before. All of these commissions were based upon abuse, were based upon corruption, were based upon excessive force. Why does it keep on happening? Well, there's several things that have been identified that show why. One, police are very powerful. When you get into law enforcement, it's one of those few occupations where you have the authority to take away someone's freedom or take away somebody's rights. Also, there's that community, that political environment. It's very influential. So again, if you get somebody in that arena and they say, hey, we want this area to be cleaned up, we want this to be done, I don't care how it's done, if you're beholden to that particular community group or that particular political environment, you might take shortcuts to get it done. And that's going to be something I'm going to talk about in a little bit here, which again will fall under the category of noble crime corruption. There's also that widespread tolerance among different community members or groups. They see what's going on, but they don't really want to get involved in it. And they know, hey, that's not right, but you know what? I don't want to get involved in it. And not only that, but it's making my neighborhood a little bit better. Yeah, there's bad things that are going on, but still, at least there's some kind of order or some kind of control. These patterns of deviance, again, they can become basically standard, just like those officers in that video. They didn't start out that way. They gradually built that direction and then got that way. Their behavior became accepted. And as it became accepted, it became more blatant. So again, there's systematic theory of corruption, which is again, it's at a level where it's allowed across the entire system or the entire organization of law enforcement. It stems from the actual nature of police work. And then there's also what's known as the rotten apple theory of corruption, where it's limited to a small number of officers who are most likely very dishonest in their previous employment, how they got employed. They slipped in through the cracks, like I said. Police come from society, society are police, police are society. And for whatever reason, these rotten apples got into the arena of law enforcement. And instead of using their authority for something positive, instead of using it to avoid someone being victimized or someone being bullied, they use it for their own benefits to exploit those that should be being served. They use it to basically get involved in corruption, to do dishonest practices and do things that should not be done anywhere, but they use their authority to do so. That's an example of under the authority of law. Now, when you think of different corruptions, again, these are ones that might not be considered that big, but these are the kind of those small little steps that really lead towards this very slippery slope. Gratitudes or gratuities, I'm sorry, are an example of that type of conduct where someone will say, "Hey, I really like having the police around because every day after school, I get all these kids that hang around my 7-Eleven. So if you come in here, I'll give you free coffee, free donuts, free potato chips. Just park out in front of the car and hang out." That's an example of it. Or if somebody says, "Hey, I really like to have law enforcement. I like what you guys are doing. I'm really supportive of you. You know what? I'm going to allow you to buy something in my store for free. But while you're here, can you please help me with this homeless encampment that I have in my backyard?" That's an example of it. So they seem very small at first, and it kind of numbs somebody to really start taking those small steps that can ultimately lead to higher and higher levels of dishonesty or misconduct. The war on drugs have really led to it in another way because when you go back now, so many drugs have been decriminalized, like we've talked about, but now you're starting to see drugs in different places, in different states that went through the decriminalization process, start to say, "Hey, we want to criminalize it again. We want to see it start to be more of an offense because we found out that some of the issues in society were based upon the decriminalization of narcotics." And so with that, you're going to see that officers are going to get back more into the proactive policing. That's always the fine line because when you're talking about the war on drugs, a lot of the issues that started to happen is you started to see corruption, you started to see economic corruption, you started to see officers using, what they did or how they did it from the aspect of personal gain, or you started to see an excessive use of force to try to extract confessions, or you started to see planting of drugs on suspects thinking that they're doing the right thing. And with that, that's kind of goes towards my next thought here, which is on noble cause corruption. Now, noble cause corruption, really, what is it? Well, I think the easiest way to explain it is with a story. So, picture in your head you have an officer who drives by this same apartment complex every single day. Every day he sees the same individual who's out there. Every day he knows from the community who has come forward and said, "Hey, this guy who stands out here sells dope to our kids all day long." But the way he sells it is very smart. He keeps the dope in a bag under a tree, and only after he knows no one's in the area, he'll go over, get the dope, walk it back, give it to the kid, and the kid will give him money, then he'll take the dope and put it back under the tree. Now the officer can't see it, the officer but doesn't watch it with his own eyes, but he knows that this is what's going on. So thinking that he's doing a better thing by stopping this individual. He stops him, he goes over, he finds this bag of dope, he comes back and says, "Hey, I'm going to have to basically do noble cause corruption to get a filing on this case. So I'm going to write my report that I observed this individual selling the dope out of his pocket in this bag to a child. The child ran away. I pulled up, took him into custody." He thinks he's doing the right thing for the right reasons because he says, "I don't want this guy selling dope to all these kids. I don't want this neighborhood basically held hostage by this individual out selling dope. So I know I didn't see all the right elements of the crime, but I can write that I saw the right elements of the crime." Basically, he thinks he's doing the right thing for the noble reason, but he's not. He or she has basically corrupted themselves. They've corrupted their position. They've corrupted law enforcement as a whole. And what they did was not beneficial to the community. Instead, it caused a legitimacy issue within the community because they're saying, "Hey, if this person's going to lie for that, what else is he going to lie on? Or what else is she going to lie on?" So that would be an example of noble cause corruption. And again, that's that slippery slope. That's that point to where someone thinks, "Well, I'm going to do the right thing because I can't do the right thing in the right way because I can't spend enough time to really observe everything. So I'm going to start taking shortcuts." So really, really important. Now, when you think about how do departments address this, how do they work through it? there's different investigations that happen. So if you had a personnel complaint against an officer, if you were stopped on the way home tonight from Cal State LA and an officer pulls you out of the car, throws you on the ground, kicks you a couple of times, tears your car apart, says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking for somebody else. I thought this was the red car I was looking for, but it wasn't." You say, "Hey, that wasn't right how I was treated. It wasn't right what happened." You go, you make a personnel complaint. That is an example of an investigation that would unfold. Now, there's two different kinds. One would be the criminal investigation, where if someone was actually breaking the law, so that noble cause corruption story that I gave you, if they found out that this officer went to court, perjured himself for that investigation, that would be an example of criminal, where there would be a criminal offense against him of perjury or her against perjury. There's also what's known as an administrative. Now, the administrative could go back to that story I just said, where you were driving home, you were pulled out of a car, your car was searched, and then the officer says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake." Again, the way the officer handled the situation was probably inappropriate. There was probably too much force involved in it. But what the investigation will find out is that, yes, there was a robbery that occurred right down the street at the donut store at the corner. And the individual that was involved in it matched the description of you who got pulled out of your car. The car matched the description. And again, he thought or she thought they were doing everything properly, but they basically deviated from policy or procedure by being a little bit too aggressive or taking too many liberties. That would be an example of an administrative approach to an investigation. So when you think about, well, how are they looked at? How are they reviewed? What are the findings on these different investigations? Here's what you would have. You would have what is known as unfounded, which basically it's determined through a review of the allegations or the complaint that it was false allegations and that there's no substance to it. There could be exonerated, and that it means basically that the act in question did not occur. It was lawful and within policy. So again, there might have been a perception on behalf of the community member who says, "Hey, what that officer did was wrong. I shouldn't have been stopped, and I was just driving home." But they find out that everything that the officer did was lawful and was within the policy and procedure of an agency. And I'm not using the example of getting pulled out of the car or anything like that. I'm just saying somebody pulls over somebody in a red car near an area where a shooting just occurred, and they stop and say, "Hey, I just want to talk to you." "Okay, you're fine, go." The person says, "I don't feel like I should have been stopped." That would be an example where, hey, yeah, it's probably best that you did get stopped. It's probably not a great feeling, but the officer articulated out that he did it for these particular circumstances and this reason. That's an example of exonerated. Not sustained is basically where there's insufficient evidence to determine that an event occurred. And then sustained is where, yes, this event definitely did occur. Now, what I wanted to show you here real quickly is total complaints. When you think of the complaints related to administrative or related to criminal, here's an example. In 2016 to 2000 or 2020, in the state of California, almost all complaints were all non-criminal. Very few were misdemeanor, and even fewer still were criminal in the sense of a felony. So here are the non-criminal complaints that occurred between those years, and there were 76,792. 94.6% of all complaints that came in law enforcement in California were for a non-criminal action. Now, on the misdemeanor during that period, again, there was a total of 2,672, which is about 3.3, so very small. And then any complaints that were related to actual criminal as far as felonies, there was 1,745 or 2.1%. And again, that's between the periods of 2016 to 2020. So again, non-criminal makes up majority, and then you have misdemeanor criminal, which again is a small number, and then felonies is very small at 2.1. But I wanted to show you that so at least you could have an understanding of how many events occur. And again, think about for each of these events, and when you look at the totals, like for an example, in the city of Los Angeles, they usually make about 2 million contacts a year, whether it's calls for service or self-initiated. So out of all of those, it's a very small number that actually make complaints. And that's when you look at the state of California, you think of the total number of contacts that occur, the total number of events where officers are involved in conversations with community members. It's still a rather small number compared to the actual number. What does all this impact? What is misbehavior organizationally? Responses that impact? Again, it's about procedural justice. And what is procedural justice and why is it so important? Procedural justice, again, the four pillars of it focus on fairness in the process, transparency, opportunities for voice, impartiality on decision making. And what do those lead to? Those lead to organizational justice, which is also important to officers. So you have the community aspect where they want to have procedural justice, they want to be treated fairly, they want to have fairness in the process. And the same token is for the officers in the organizational perspective, is that they want to feel that they're supported. They want to feel that they have laws and values that are judged at them and looked at them. And they also know that organizationally they have to adhere to certain policies and procedures to make sure that works. Now, in general, when you think about it, that procedural justice component from the community aspect is the foundation of what we are having these conversations about. Because if you don't have procedural justice, if you don't have 21st century policing aspects, you will not have legitimacy in policing. If you don't have legitimacy in policing, that basically means the community that that agency serves do not believe that they have the law enforcement agency that services them has the authority to actually have oversight or control of them. And so again, that's why misconduct is so necessarily and unequivocally approached by organizations to address proactively before it unfolds. If and when it does unfold, there's systems in place to stop it, to rectify it, and to hold those accountable. And that is why it is, because when you have to articulate out to the community that you serve that yes, you understand that the organizational policy and procedure were deviated, and here's what we are taking actions on to make sure it doesn't happen again, that they believe you are actually doing that, that it was transparent, that they had a voice in saying it and the decision making. Same thing for the officers within the organization. Well, there has to be organizational justice as well, because the officers want to feel that they are supported, that if they go out there, do their job correctly, do it ethically, do it morally, that they will have the support of the organization. If they adhere to policies and procedures, their actions will be reviewed. They will also have a voice. They will also have actions to show the process, and there will be transparency for them as well. So we covered a lot. We went through a lot of information, but I hope the information was incredibly important to you because it's incredibly important to the subject of police and society. So again, please get into your texts, get more into the weeds. The Canvas question that we're going to have this week specifically talks about steps that have been taken in the arena of procedural justice to have transparency. So when you get into the subject matter on the Canvas question, please answer the questions as you think is important, as you think is relevant towards what your experiences are, towards what the data suggests, towards what the documents that I supply suggest. So again, you have a Canvas question, we have some lecture questions, and then please make sure that you are looking at the research paper and starting that process. All the material, all of the directions are supplied for you. They are in the first module, and it's actually listed under the research oversight or the research paper. So we'll open that up. The material's there, the information's there, and you have plenty of time. I gave you almost 4 weeks to complete it, so it's up to you to do time management to get it done. There is a lot of points there, so if you miss this, you will have a hard time really getting those points ever back. So I hope that no one misses this. Please get that research paper done. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to having a couple more discussions with you as the semester continues to unfold. Take care of yourself.